Good afternoon. Hello, I am Karadina Sale. I'm a social worker with the Community Technical Assistance Center at NYU's Silver School Social Works McSilver Institute. And I would like to welcome you to today's training called Can We Talk? Supporting those who care for young people with suicidal ideation. Good afternoon. Everyone's chatting in. Thank you. Today's webinar is a follow-up to the release of our brochure that we created last month called Supporting a Young Person Who May Be Considering Suicide, Information for Parents and Caregivers. Our hope is that today's offering will provide an invaluable opportunity to spend time discussing challenges and barriers to communicating around this critical issue. Suicide is the third leading cause of death for adolescents and young adults aged 15 to 24, and the second leading cause of death for those aged 10 to 14 in the United States. The unique set of stressors faced by young people puts them at greater risk for attempting suicide. We also know that talking to youth about mental health and suicide can be difficult or anxiety-provoking. When it comes to approaching a conversation with a young person about mental health and suicide, it is normal for caregivers to feel overwhelmed or ill-equipped and turn to social service and mental health providers for support. Today's webinar is to really help you who are working with parents and caregivers and concerned that the young person in their life may be considering suicide. Before we get started, I want to orient everyone to our Zoom webinar in case you haven't been with us today. And if you have, this is a little bit of a review. Everyone is on mute to avoid any background noises. If you have any technical issues, please chat into our host, Kiara, who will be able to assist you. Please submit any questions you may have during any time today in the chat, and I will be collecting those to share during our Q&A. And lastly, for your best viewing experiences, you can go to the top right corner and click view and click side-by-side speaker for your best viewing experience. Many thanks to my colleagues for presenting with me today. Dr. Anthony Salerno is a psychologist, and he's the Innovation and Implementation Officer at the McSilver Institute for Poverty Policy Research. And Jackie Garlock is a new addition to our team over the past 2 months, is a social worker and the Assistant Director of Training Development at NYU's McSilver Institute for Poverty Policy and Research. So thanks again for being with us. We can go to the next slide just to see our agenda. This is what we're going to be doing today. We're going to talk about the importance of caregivers and preventing youth suicide, preparing caregivers for the conversation, addressing some common challenges, and supporting caregivers in really navigating those next steps. Next slide. Suicide among young people. As I mentioned, it is the second leading cause of death. This is a statistics from the New York State Suicide Prevention Task Force, a report in 2019. 1 in 5 contemplate suicide. 1 in 5 high schoolers report having thoughts of suicide each day. And then 17% of adolescents aged 12 to 17 will experience at least one major depressive episode. I don't need to tell you all that we are in the middle of a mental health crisis for young people. Chat into us if you are concerned about young people who may be considering suicide. We'd love to hear some of your thoughts. Yes, slides will be made available. Thank you. Is this an issue you are currently dealing with? I imagine it is, otherwise you may not be here with us today. And it's a really big challenge. And so that's why we really wanted to have this time set aside to talk with you all. Yes, this is a current issue. I hear hope. Absolutely, from Lacey. Okay. Well, one of the most important things in a young person's life. Can we go back? Sorry. One of the most important things in a young person's life, as you all know, is a relationship with a caregiver. We know that the presence of a caring and attentive adult, especially a caregiver, is a primary protective factor for young people. We know that if we are looking at the literature around all the challenges and struggles that young people have, if they have a strong relationship with a trusted adult, especially if it's their primary caregiver, they're going to have less stress in their lives, right? If we look at youth who are struggling with coming out or with being accepted by family members, if they are LGBTQ plus youth identifying and they are worried about being rejected from their caregivers and their immediate family, they are 8 times more likely to attempt suicide. And then we do know that population level research has shown that the presence of supportive individuals knowledgeable of the signs and factors of for suicide and risk factors, and that importance around connecting with individuals to treatment is affecting at lowering suicide rates. And so this relationship with caregivers is incredibly, incredibly important. And so I'm going to pass it on to Dr. Salerno, who's going to talk about assessing the relationship.
Thank you so much, Karen. Also, I noticed in some of the folks who were chatting in that this is not just a professional challenge, that for some, it's a personal challenge. It's an issue that's within their own families. And what is important around that is that no matter what position you're in, the challenges, the issues, the stressors that young people can go through can lead to a point where there is an increase in depression, there's an increase in anxiety, that the overall stress. And when youngsters feel trapped, when they don't feel that they really have any alternative, that's sort of like a very scary place to be. And so, I have raised 3 children, and almost the littlest things would set me off, right? Where they were angry or very upset about something, or feeling very down, or had a breakup in a relationship, or did really poorly on a test. All of us as caregivers, as parents, that we know how sensitive we are to the emotional experience of our young ones. So the issue of relationship, and I think it's really important to kind of think about, well, okay, you're a practitioner and you're working with youth and working with the family, because this really is about those times when you have contact with caregivers for whom their loved one, a youth, is really struggling. And how can you be supportive to them? The brochure, again, was just a resource or a tool to provide you with some kind of guidance, because this is not easy stuff, to talk about. But the issue, I think one of the major first steps in your work, and this is probably true for all the young people you work with, is what is the nature of the relationship between the young person and their caregivers? That is a critical piece, because as Kara mentioned, we know something about resilience. A positive relationship, right, is really the foundation around keeping open communication. And we all know that it's very easy. Young people can be very sensitive to the things we say or don't say to them. And we can shut them down. There's no question, about that. And so being very aware that the primary issue is how do we keep the lines open, so that if my child is really struggling with something, what comes to mind for them, I could talk to mom or dad about this, or to a relative, or to just a trusting adult, that I can talk to them about this, right? And they won't respond in a way that I'll either feel ashamed or dismiss it or minimize it, be taken seriously, and that I can be heard. So I just want to make that point around that part of good clinical practice is assessing the nature and the quality of the relationship, because that has a lot to do as a protective factor. So those ongoing support and creating relational norms of talking about mental health, that there is conversations, right? It just doesn't come up when you're really scared to death that the young person may be at serious risk. But there are ongoing conversations just about the day-to-day kinds of worries and anxieties, which communicates to the young person, you know what, when you're worried about something, if you're scared about something, if you're angry about something, if it has to do with us, it has to do with school, that we're a support to you. And how do caregivers communicate that to their loved ones? So I think the major point here is, before we even talk about the high risk issues around self-harm and suicide, is to really support and identify the nature of the relationship. Let's go to the next slide. So let's just kind of get you a sense of, where are you in the relevance of this issue? What is your experience working with the caregiver of youth who has engaged in suicidal, thinks about self-harm? Is this something, yes, in the past, yes, currently, or this is, I'm interested in this, but I haven't had to deal with it. We just want to get a sense of what the audience experience is like out there. So you've had to deal with this in the past, and you may have to deal with it again in the future, or I'm dealing with it right now. Or, this, I'm interested in this topic and this could happen in the future, but I haven't experienced it or have to deal with it yet. We'll just wait a moment and then we'll see. We'll see what the experience is out there. Kara, how is it going?
Good. We have about 75% participation.
Okay, that's good. Okay, so we can see that there's a large number, nearly 50%. This isn't an academic issue. This is, I'm dealing with this now. So that's really important. A number of folks who are curious, want to know more, and then many have also dealt with this in the past. And I have no doubt you're concerned about dealing with this in the future. Thank you for that. Let's go to the next slide, which is the next poll. So when it comes to your confidence level, and I've done many years of clinical work, I've got to say, this has always been the touchiest one for me, right? This is the one that scares me and maybe scares most practitioners. But how confident do you feel that in supporting caregivers with children, youth who might be, involved in suicidal ideation, self-harm? So A would be, you're very confident. I know what to do. I'm confident. I'm a little bit I'm just not that confident. It really worries me. Let's get a sense of your confidence level. Yeah. Okay. So thank you, Melinda, for chatting that in. You can also, folks can use the poll. Are folks having a difficult time hearing me? I'm just getting some chats that. Okay. All good. All right. Thank you. Okay. So I'll be a little bit louder just in case. Great. Thank you, Ann. So once we get to about 75%, Kiara, let's see what the results are. So, okay. So no one is saying, look, and you know what? I don't know who would say very, it's rare. Thank you for the person or two, several, 10 folks who feel very confident. So this must be an area of expertise. Please chat in as we go along if you have found things that have been helpful. So we really want to reach out to the folks who are really very confident, which means you have experience with this and you've done things that have been helpful. That's terrific. A good number are confident. And some are like in that middle, right? The 55% somewhat confident. And then there are some saying, look, I really want to get some tips and some ideas that can be helpful. Because at this point in time, I'm just not confident when I go into that situation. That's one of our goals, is we want to help folks to kind of move towards feeling a little bit more confident with some of the tools and some of the ideas that I'm sharing with you. Let's close the poll and let's go to the next slide.
Thanks so much, Tony. And I think that, yeah, exactly like you said, any sort of tips and tricks that folks who have dealt with this a lot that can share, because I think that's what makes some of these spaces so valuable, is being able to sort of share that wisdom that you all have gained in the field. Because this is, this is a scary issue. I think, Tony, you and I have talked about this, that this for a lot of folks is sort of the nightmare issue. It really is the thing that is the scariest, both for parents and caregivers, but also for us as providers who are supporting young people and also supporting caregivers. So there's sort of 3 steps that we are going to go through today in terms of how, if you are in the position where you are talking with a caregiver, where you're supporting a caregiver, to help them in preparing for talking about this with the young person in their life. So the first thing we're going to talk about is building awareness. We're then going to go into a little bit, some tips and tricks about having the conversation. And then we're going to talk about what happens after that conversation. Where can a parent go for additional support? Now, obviously, that'll depend on your role with the caregiver. Maybe you are that support for them. And maybe there's also, it's looking into what are other supports that families, caregivers might need. So we'll start out here with the building awareness. This really is what are things that caregivers should look out for. Now, I'm sure that many of you all are aware of some of these common signs and symptoms of suicidality amongst young people. You can see in this next slide some of these signs. So we have some things about talking about feeling hopeless, feeling like a burden. So it can be aspects of the conversation, but it also can be things you observe in their behavior, maybe higher risk taking, maybe withdrawing from friends or from activities they used to enjoy, increasing use of substances. You also might observe, you also might talk with caregivers about observing sudden drastic changes in mood that can be both in the sort of negative direction, but also can be in the positive direction. If a young person's been depressed for a long time and has been expressed suicidality and is now all of a sudden acting as if everything is fine, that is also something you might want to encourage a caregiver to look out for. Changes in sleep, withdrawing, feeling isolated. Some of these things might be more of a red flag than others, but it also depends on the young person that we're talking about. And this is really getting back to what Tony, Dr. Salerno talked about earlier about the quality of the relationship. You really want to support caregivers in having those ongoing conversations with a young person so that they can see those changes over time, and also so that they can tune into what is up with their child, with the young person in their life. I also wanted to, and I forgot to do this in our last slide, but I wanted to bring up the brochure. I know we're going to stop sharing for a second. Thanks, Kara, for letting me know about this. We have alluded to the brochure. This is something that the CTAC put out last month. This is a brochure that if you are a provider working with a caregiver or working with a young person, this can help to sort of facilitate some of these conversations. So Kara's going to help us to sort of take a look at this brochure now.
Yes, I am. Sorry, I'm having some technical issues, but
no worries.
Right here.
Everyone, I'm sure, is familiar with that feeling as well.
Okay, can everyone see this? This is our brochure. It is 2 pages and we have it in English and Spanish. So we did chat into you all the links so that you could see it. And then if I could just make it bigger here. So this is the one side. And here's the other side. So step 1 is know the signs. Step 2 is having the conversation that we're really talking about today, focused on. And then step 3 is connecting to resources. Okay.
Thanks so much, Kara.
Having the pamphlet, having the brochure in Nepali as well. Ashley, we will look into that. Thank you.
Oh, fantastic. So you'll be able to find the link to that was in the chat. I think we can probably put it again in the chat. But also you can find all of that and many more resources on the CTAC website. So you can download a copy of that and print it out. We tried to do it in sort of low color so that if you need to print out in black and white, that's fine. And again, that the Spanish version is there as well. Let me find the link again.
I can do it.
Oh, fantastic. Thanks, Kara. So one thing, and Dr. Salerno, you talked before about the relationship. One thing that can be particularly challenging when we're talking about young people is things are changing for them already, right? There's always this shift over time. And so I'm wondering, Dr. Salerno, if you could talk to us a little bit about if you're working with a caregiver and they're not sure, like, I'm not really sure, is this just normal teenage behavior? Is this just normal adolescence? I don't know, things change for this young person all the time. What might you say to a caregiver that brings that to you?
Well, I think this is still one of those areas where you don't want to find yourself having to make those judgments. This is normal. And then, this is not normal. I think that that's like a huge challenge to sort of say, well, if I put it into the bucket of this is kind of normal, I can just sort of forget about it. Right. And you don't know, of course, want to overdo it as well. Right. That every time there's any kind of angst, I was a high school teacher and a school counselor for a number of years before I became a psychologist. And, all of us anyone who's raised young people and if you've worked with them, that it can be a very chaotic, very emotional time where there's many developmental challenges taking place. And youngsters can be very, very moody. At one time, they're feeling terrific. Another time, they're, the world is coming to an end. And I think one of the important pieces, and I think the point I really want to make is, I don't think if the caregiver doesn't have a trusting relationship, then having these questions or ways of dealing with this, it's not going to work very well, because it's in the absence of trust and safety. And that is really the critical piece. And you don't just create that like overnight, right? So if you're working with caregivers, I think an important piece is that this isn't just about starting a conversation when you're scared to death, but this is like opening a conversation around everything. How a young person's reacting to things in school, how a person may think about what's going on in the politics today. What about sports? I mean, it's just the idea that we can actually engage in mutual conversation. And that when a young person brings up issues that you may agree with or disagree with, you don't shut them down. I think that's really the critical piece. You can very easily get a young person to say, I'm just going to keep it to myself and never talk to you. It doesn't take much. So, I mean, it's a big challenge for all of us, right? Is to be able to communicate with young people in a way that we communicate a sense of respect, that we want to listen more than talk to them. They're very used to being told what to do. They're very used to having a critical parent language. What they're not so used to is someone creating a space for them that they can share what's on their mind and not overreact to it. I think that's an important piece for us to emphasize.
Thanks so much, Dr. Salerno. And yeah, I think also encouraging, if a parent isn't sure, have that conversation, open up those lines of communication. If you're not sure whether you should ask about this one thing, well, ask about other things, right? Ask about having those conversations with your child to normalize it so that they do feel comfortable coming to you if and when there is a problem. Thank you so much. So we're now going to talk a little bit about setting up these conversations, or rather supporting caregivers in setting up these conversations. So this is, if a caregiver is coming to you asking about having these conversations, some things you might want to encourage them to consider is that when, where, and how. So you want to encourage them to be mindful about when they're having these conversations, not doing it at a time when they're rushed or at the time when a young person is stressed out, distracted, in a rush. Sometimes it can be tempting to bring this up when emotions are already high. I am already having an intense conversation with you. And maybe thinking with caregivers, this is already a hard thing to do. So waiting until they are regulated and the young person is in a regulated space. We also know that research has shown that it can be helpful not to make this like a crazy intense deal for a young person, but rather to pick a scenario in which a caregiver is already spending time with the young person in their life. This really goes back to what you were saying, Dr. Salerno, about how really it's about fostering that relationship and then utilizing the time that you're already spending with a young person, whether it's driving in the car or doing household chores, to have conversations about their mental health. The other thing to keep in mind is that young person's privacy. So if there's other people around, maybe taking that into account about if you're deciding to have that conversation then. And then again, going back to that how about sort of avoiding making a big scene, but rather let it be a natural way of checking in. So the other thing to know is that preparation is key. And Kara, I think that you're going to help us to think through this. Is that correct? I'm looking through, sorry.
Preparation is key. Yes.
Oh, sorry. No, this is, I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry, Kara. This is me as well. So, you want to encourage caregivers to prepare for this conversation. Now, if a caregiver is coming to you, they're already thinking that they need to be prepared for this conversation. And we also know, and I'm seeing in the chat, that a lot of times caregivers have a lot of feelings about this. Someone said they might think that their child is attention seeking. I think I saw someone mention in the chat. So knowing what and a caregiver might have a lot of feelings about this. So encouraging them to take steps to acknowledge their feelings about the conversation or the topic. You might want to you're going to want to validate and normalize this. It's a hard thing to talk about, and helping a caregiver to acknowledge that can help to pave the way for them being able to do it. And then also supporting them in anticipating potential hot buttons. Okay, well, when my daughter complains about her boyfriend, that brings up feelings in me. What are the hot button? What are the sensitive spots for the caregiver? And then additionally, working with caregivers to take stock of their own coping mechanisms so that they can go into the conversation centered and calm and able to manage any of those triggers that do come up for them. So how do you get started? This is a conversation, something that we know can come up for folks. How do you open it up? It can be the hardest thing. It's like writing from a blank page, starting from scratch. The getting started can often be the hardest thing. There are many, many ways that you can open this conversation, and there's no right way to do it. One way, however, that we know can be really helpful, especially if you're talking to a caregiver that really needs something concrete, is to use the combination of sharing the observation and the feeling, and then following it up with a request to talk about it. So you can see some examples here. So I've been noticing that you don't hang out with your friends anymore, stay in your room all the time, blah, 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 whatever the observed behavior is. And I'm worried about you. So you're going to pair it with that expression of concern, of care, of empathy. I feel like you haven't been acting like yourself lately, and it's got me concerned. This is also a time where you can maybe encourage a caregiver to share their own issues to help normalize it for the young person in their life. I know how bad it can feel. When I was young, I had a lot of feelings that I, are similar, or even as an adult, sometimes I struggle with my own feelings or mental health. And then to follow all of this up with a request. And the request here is going to be to check in, to talk about it. Can we talk about what is bothering you? I want to check in about how you're doing. I'm here to listen. What is going on? Now, again, this is not the only way to open a conversation, but having this sort of formula can make a caregiver that maybe feels not so confident feel a little bit more confident going into the conversation. I'm wondering if anyone has anything in the chat, other tips or tricks for getting started in these conversations that you might share with a caregiver who's feeling a little nervous or who's feeling a little concerned about getting started. So if you have those ideas, I would really encourage you all to share them. So we're now going to get into talking about the sort of meat of the conversation once it's already opened. And Dr. Salerno, I'm wondering if you could help us to talk through asking explicitly about suicide.
Yeah, is there a slide that goes with this?
Yes.
Okay. Okay.
There.
So, at some point, and again, this is not where you start off. At some point, after you've kind of gave a rationale for why are you bringing this up, right? And then you're really inviting the young person to speak to you about it. So you're kind of communicating, one, I can really handle this. I'm very concerned about you. That's why I'm bringing this issue up. That's what precedes any of this. But through that conversation, if the young person is able to open up, accepts that invitation to talk, then they may be sharing things that really kind of worry you, right? That are worrisome, that have, they're associated with some of those signs and those risk factors that we'd already shared with you. And you want to really get to the point. At some, because you can feel like you're just talking around the issue. At some point, you may simply the caregiver may need, as we as practitioners may be in that same situation where we do raise it more directly. And that is, are you thinking about killing yourself, of hurting yourself? Do you ever wish that you could just go to sleep and never wake up? Are you feeling so bad that you're thinking about harming yourself? Those are ways, and now you're getting to be a little bit more specific to kind of get a sense of, the degree to which the young person really is thinking about this. And one of the issues, of course, if you're working with a caregiver, just the person saying those words out loud can be like almost feeling impossible, right? There is sometimes a superstition that we can have, which is if you raise it or you ask the question, you actually can make it happen. It's kind of a superstitious way of thinking. Gee, if we just don't talk about it, then it won't happen, right? It's not real. But we know that that's not the case. And so this is one of those situations where helping a caregiver feel comfortable with saying these words is an opportunity for some role playing. I would say that that's one of the things to consider, is so that the caregiver actually hears themselves saying those words. And it could be any one of these things, right? But you're getting at that point, Johnny or Mary, have things gotten so bad? Are you feeling so trapped or hopeless that you sometimes wonder the best way to do it is to kind of end it all, right? Is maybe hope that you just don't wake up, that you would kill yourself. That sometimes people get to that point. And I just want to make sure that this is with me, you can talk to me about that. How you respond to the way that young person responds to any of your questions, you can respond in a way that can shut the person down, or you respond in a way that helps that person to feel safe, because it's all about feeling safe, right? And feeling a sense of trust, and that I'll be heard. And that's the emphasis, is that I just want to hear. I'm just going to sit back and listen. The tendency would be to try to solve it, fix it as fast as you can. That's not just for caregivers. We as practitioners often can find ourselves doing that as well. So I think that's the point here in helping a caregiver. The brochure is really designed to kind of also provide some guidance, something that the caregiver can review on her own or his own, right? So that's another important piece. But caregivers need some guidance and support in being able to raise these very scary issues. Someone had mentioned about validating the feelings. You couldn't said it better. Validation, empathy, a way of responding that invites the person to tell me more. Tell me more. This is a safe space for you. You got to avoid premature fixing. That's one way to shut things down, or to minimize it. There's a lot of ways that we can, as practitioners as well. These are not just skills and approaches for caregivers. These are the kinds of things that we need to keep in mind in our work with youth as well.
Yes, indeed. And Tony, we also have here some information about that caregivers can ask to assess for risk.
Yeah.
So once someone has asked the question, asking some of those follow-up questions.
Yeah, I mean, you want to know, thinking about hurting yourself, as we say, the statistics on the number of people who actually it crosses their mind, right? And maybe through an entire lifetime, there may be periods in all our lives where we might actually have that fleeting thought, right? Is that I wouldn't have to deal with this if I just wasn't alive anymore. And so one of the issues is, has it gone further than just thinking about it? Of course, you have thoughts, right? Which are kind of abstract. What's not abstract is if you have a method, if you have been thinking about what you would do, how you would do it, if you've actually spent time thinking about how could people, kill themselves. I mean, then you have, those sorts of inquiries as well, right? Any steps that you've taken, right? And that's now going beyond thinking to actually planning. And that is an important distinction to make and to explore that area.
Thanks so much for sharing that. And And someone actually asked this recently in the chat about what to do when a caregiver knows that they're going to have their own stuff that is going to come up, or that they get distracted. I can't remember. I saw it come up in the chat that they get distracted because of things that come up. And a lot of things can come up in these conversations that can be upsetting. You might learn that your child has been skipping school and you didn't know about that. Or maybe they've been engaging in high-risk behavior that you didn't know about. And so one thing that we know can be really helpful is to help caregivers. We talked a little bit about preparing for specific triggers in advance, but also helping caregivers to think about things they can do in the moment so that they don't get derailed, so that they don't, so that they're able to stay present and able to give that empathetic, active listening ear that the young person needs. So we have some self-regulation strategies listed here. There are a million more out there that I'm sure that you all have found through your work, and we encourage you to share any that you found particularly successful for caregivers in the chat. But so 3 we've listed here. 1 is to give caregivers some self-talk statements. This can be helpful, especially when they're hearing things that are hard to hear. So the child is telling them about increasing substance use or skipping school, helping them to say to themselves, my child is suffering and that this behavior is part of that. Or to keep telling themselves, it is good that they are telling me this, even though it is hard for me to hear. We also know grounding techniques. This is helpful in many situations, not just in hard conversations, but helping caregivers to be aware of what helps them to ground themselves. So whether it's doing some deep breathing, making sure that they have water available to themselves so they can take a sip of water, or using sensory tools. So maybe that means doing sort of like a little mini mindfulness meditation where they can locate objects around the room, giving themselves some nice smelling things or soft things to touch, fidgets to play with, whatever that caregiver needs to help keep them centered and grounded. And then also giving that caregiver permission to take breaks as needed. So if something really scary or intense or hard to hear comes up, encouraging the caregiver to notice that they might be getting overwhelmed and giving them also some language to share with their child so that they are not closing the door on the conversation, but rather that they're taking whatever the break that they need so that they can be present with them and continue to keep that communication open and to not unintentionally shut it down through an emotional reaction. So you might encourage them to say something like, thank you for telling me that, even though it's tough for me to hear, I'm going to take 5 minutes, 10 minutes, whatever, to process this, and then we can continue talking. So these are all tools that you can go through with caregivers in advance so that they can be prepared in the moment when they are in the conversation. We also have here some do's and don'ts. You'll see these are do's and don'ts that are echoed in the brochure. And Dr. Salerno, you've mentioned a couple of these already. So we have here speaking openly and directly, making sure to take threats seriously, letting the young person know that what they're feeling is okay and expressing empathy, and then being prepared to listen. And then again, Dr. Salerno, you alluded to making sure that they are not coming from a place of judgment or reacting with shock or anger. You've mentioned not wanting to minimize the youth's advice, the youth's feelings or experience, and then again, not to jump to that advice fixing. And you also want to encourage them not to give up after one try or to wait to get help if they assess that this is an emergency situation or something where the crisis is more acute. So here we have some of these common questions and concerns that you will see that sort of reflect some of the things that we just saw in the do's and don'ts. So I know that this is something that we saw folks mention in the chat, that parents sometimes express skepticism of the young person, either saying that they're being attention seeking, they're overreacting, they're just being dramatic. Some things that you might, if that is something that is coming up with the caregiver that you are speaking with, you can both normalize that feeling, that because it is true. Sometimes young people in our lives do have very big feelings about things to us as adults that can seem like not a big deal. And also encouraging them to not use that information to minimize a youth's experience. So encouraging them to manage their own feelings of frustration internally, but to then validate all of the young person's emotions. So, and to discourage them for saying things like, it's not that big of a deal, or don't be upset. These are things that folks sometimes say with the best of intentions. Oh, don't be upset. That's not such a big deal. Really wanting to try and make that young person feel better, but really it can unintentionally sometimes invalidate the young person's experience. And so we want to discourage that from being sort of the go-to response. I'm worried I won't know the right thing to say. That's definitely something that we often hear and from caregivers, is that this is a hard conversation. What if I don't know the right thing to say? So we have some go-to language can be a helpful thing for helping caregivers to feel more confident. And we have some examples here of different go-to language that you can help caregivers to prepare. They can acknowledge the emotion that is coming up for the young person. It sounds like you're really disappointed. Or they can express empathy. That sounds so hard. I'm so sorry you have to go through this. They can express gratitude. Thank you for trusting me with this. And then also giving caregivers permission to admit that they don't know. So saying something along the lines of, I don't even know what to say right now, but I'm glad that you are telling me. What if they deny that there is a problem? So this is something that we know can be a common concern, or it can be a concern that even is why the caregiver is talking to you in the first place. So they might insist that everything is fine, but you would want to encourage that caregiver to, again, not give up, try again. Dr. Salerno, you talked a lot about the relationship, and this is where that comes in. This shouldn't be a one and done, right? This is about opening up those lines of communication. Also, again, helping the caregiver to become aware of how this is affecting them, in terms of, this is really frustrating that the young person in my life is not admitting that there is a problem when I can clearly see evidence of otherwise, but really resisting that urge to become angry, to shout, and being okay with taking a break and trying it again with a different time. We also, this is also where you might encourage caregivers to use their allies. Is there another grown-up in this young person's life that they trust? Maybe there's a mentor, a teacher, a coach, and encouraging caregivers to sort of use that community of care to be able to support a young person. Dr. Salerno, you already sort of alluded to this, but what if my child won't take my advice? This can be so tempting to want to advise, especially when you think that the young person is handling things in a way that is making things worse or is not the right way to do it. And we want to encourage caregivers to resist that urge to jump to advice or fixing, which can be so hard when you care so much. This is a young person, is for this caregiver, they are, their child, right? This is somebody they care the most about in the world. And so it can really be so tempting to want to fix. And yet jumping to solutions can unintentionally communicate to that young person that they're not able to hold space for the pain that this young person is experiencing, but rather that they're trying to just make the problem seem manageable. And so it's about helping those caregivers to prepare to just sit and listen again, even when it's hard to hear or upsetting.
But, in addition to that, there is some, I don't know if we call it advice, but some of the questions that come to mind for me is, did you talk to your therapist about this? Or, so that's one thing so that would be in a sense, my advice in a sense is that, when you're going through things like this, you might be concerned about bringing it up, but is that something that you would feel comfortable talking to your therapist about? Because, we're talking to practitioners now, right? Where the youth is in services. So that that would be certainly something to discuss. And what could be helpful to you? What would you find helpful at this time, while you're going through this? That's another way you're kind of saying, well, I'm not going to give you the advice, but do you have advice for me in what I can do to be helpful, when you're going through this, so part of it is listening, but maybe the youth does have some ideas of what would be helpful. So you would invite them, instead of you giving the advice, you're actually exploring the degree to which they have some good ideas about how to try to address this sort of thing. So anyway, I think that might be something to consider as well.
Thank you so much, Dr. Salandra. I think that's really spot on. So locating additional support, Kara, I'm wondering if you can tell us a little bit more about that, sort of after the conversation is over, or even as the conversation is going, what do we know about locating additional support?
Yeah, we may need to help caregivers access other support, right? It may be a situation where maybe they could attend some groups with their young person. Maybe they could attend some other types of sessions with their young person. You're amazing, by the way, chatting in so many amazing things. And you've actually chatted in several different kinds of trainings as caregivers, but as practitioners as well. So thank you. So those may be some supports to access, right? It's also about the severity of the problem, right? So understanding whether it's a really high risk situation or a really low risk. I mean, I think anytime a young person has any suicidal ideation, it's high risk, right? And then we need to think about the plan, as we mentioned, about access to things. So if there's a plan and if there is access to things to follow through with that plan, then there may be a need for severe, intervention right away, such as hospitalization, or are there different alternatives, right? So having these conversations with caregivers is incredibly important, and planning to do what if the young person refuses help or asks the caregiver not to do anything, right? So what other supports can we think about bringing into the young person's life and the caregiver's life to support this crisis, right? And then encouraging caregivers to include the youth in decision-making regarding the next steps as possible. So if you go to the next slide, one of the things that we think could be really helpful is creating a family safety plan. And so I don't know if this is something, if you do this with families, please chat in, because I think this can be so incredibly helpful, where you find a list of resources that a youth can access when overwhelmed, that you as a caregiver could access, that the caregivers that you're working with could access. Because I recognize there actually are a lot of caregivers on the line here. This may be a list of people to reach out to, coping strategies, harm reduction strategies. There may be a schedule of check-ins. So maybe we check in every morning and every night and see how you're doing, right? There may be a plan to have a trusted adult with your young person, or for caregivers to have a trusted adult with their young person at all times. And who is that? And how does that person communicate with the caregiver? And how does that person communicate with the young person, right? And so that this idea that we're wrapping around services for young people in general is so important. And during these moments of crises, even more important. And so plans to take, a plan for steps to take in a really acute crisis situation. So what numbers are you going to call? What's the nearest hospital? Or what can you go to your pediatrician first? What are those steps to take? So that family safety plan can be incredibly helpful for both the caregiver and the young person, but also you as the provider. And what a family chooses to include in that list is, it varies. It's going to vary, as it just was looking at that last bullet, but we can go to the next slide. After the conversation. So after the caregiver has had this conversation, it's helpful to encourage caregivers to use what they learn constructively. So they want to think about the information that their young person has shared with them, and they never ever want to use it against them, right? And so I think that's just the main point here is one, if that relationship is opening in a way where a young person is trusting their caregiver to share this information, then what happens? Because somebody chatted earlier that, a lot of the questions that are coming up right now are, what if the caregiver is the reason the young person is feeling suicidal, or the young person has suicidal ideation? What if the caregiver is the person that's kind of causing this? And I think that's a really important question. And I think it goes back to what we said in the very beginning of this webinar. I'd love Jackie and Tony to chat and to chime in as well, because I think it's about how do you take some steps back and really think about how can we strengthen this relationship between this young person and their caregiver, and if that, and also safety, right? Safety is really important. And if that young person isn't safe, how are we going to intervene? How are we going to intervene to help strengthen this relationship? And how are we going to intervene to protect this young person, right? Tony or Jackie, do you have any thoughts about that? That question's come up about 4 or 5 different times.
I don't want to jump in case Tony, you have something to say,
No,
but
go ahead. No, go ahead, Jackie.
I think exactly what you're saying, Kara, is really attuning to the relationship itself. And so also, you know, a lot of the tips that we're giving are coming from the perspective that we are assuming that a caregiver is coming to a professional because they have concerns about a young person in their life. That might be a young person that the professional is working with, but it also could be a caregiver that is coming separately from a therapeutic or you know, helping relationship with the young person. Now, if it turns out that the young person has shared that there is abuse going on in the home, or that maybe it's not abuse, but that the cause of the distress is coming from the relationship with the caregiver, then obviously the goal of these conversations is going to shift. It's not going to be so much about getting this information from the young person on behalf of the caregiver, but again, about supporting improving that relationship. So maybe it's about how they communicate, generally speaking. Maybe it's about how the relationship, plays out in terms of other siblings in the home, or in terms of how they talk about school or relationships or friendships, and sort of attuning to those needs. If that is indeed the underlying cause of the distress. And we know, as you said in the very beginning, Kara, that issues in terms of the caregiver relationship can impact young people so intensely. We know that having a attentive, caring adult in their life can be such a protective factor, and then lacking that can be such a source of distress. And so really working to improve that relationship, or to support them in getting their needs met so that they can work on their relationship.
The only thing I would add is that becomes the focus of treatment.
Yeah.
And I'd want to make sure that the young person recognizes that, because in one way, I don't know if this young person, if it has to do with family conflict or the problems that caregivers are having, right, is the one message I want to get, especially if the youth blames themselves. Self-blame is a very high risk factor. And I think trying to sort out, and you could imagine young people being very prone to that, right? But being able to say, you know, one of the areas of treatment and of service provision is going to be to kind of take a look at those factors that are contributing to the person's sense of, you know, feeling overwhelmed or stressed or hopeless. And that opens up everything. What are the situations? What's happening within the family? I think my way of responding would be, that's got to be like the focus of my treatment, is to identify what of those issues, but not one has to avoid also now, let's blame the family now. Let's blame the caregiver. I think one has to be very cautious about that. The work is about, let's find out who's to blame. Is what you're really looking at is what's explaining some of this. What are the factors that is contributing to the youth having a sense of isolation or lack of support? What is happening in the lives of the caregivers, which is interfering with them being as effective caregivers as possible? What are the challenges, the stresses in their own lives? So I think one has to bring a compassion, a patience, and an understanding that there's a lot of suffering going on, and the suffering, and that's part of our role, is to be able to now enter that system so that we can relieve some of that suffering, communicate a sense of hopefulness, and then having a plan of action to address some of those things. I think that's the best that one can do.
Yeah. And I do want to just mention, though, that, you know, encouraging caregivers to look after their own needs can be so critical, right? Not only after the conversation, before the conversation, during the conversation, after the conversation. And this can be either through self-care or, seeking their own professional support to help them during this time. And so I just didn't want to forget to mention that as well.
Yeah, very good point, Kara. I think it's a very important issue. I think some folks chatted that in, is that this is also, again, you bring a sense of compassion to everyone involved, and self-care for both the youth and for the caregiver is they're equally valuable and equally important.
And I think also, just to add to that, Kara, that, and I think I saw someone write in the chat about parents having an awareness to other people in the child's life, whether it's the child's peers, but also other adults in the young person's life. And I think part of what the goal of these conversations between caregiver and young person is to remind the young person that they're not alone, that there is somebody that cares for them, that wants to know these things. And then that is a similar message that also we can provide to caregivers, that they are also not alone, that there are other people that, and, I know in Kara, you mentioned in the chat, eco mapping, whether, that there are people that are in the community, that are in the parent's life, that are in the young person's life, that do care. And so that they are also not alone, you also as a professional are there to support them. And then also that there are other supports available, that this is sort of, also about reminding people or helping people to recognize or access the community that they have available to them.
Great. Thank you so much. We do have a few questions. We have a few minutes left, so if we could get to them. We have, somebody says, how can we support a caregiver who struggles with their own suicidal ideation, and having to have the conversation with their child may be triggering? Any thoughts, Jackie or Tony?
I mean, the more obvious thing is that that's someone also who needs support and needs help. I think my role, because I'm thinking of myself as I'm a practitioner, and this comes up, and it'd be very clear that my conversation with the caregiver would be about recognizing that, and that what kind of support, guidance, therapy, all sorts of things that would be a support to that person. I mean, I think that that's the way I would, would approach it. And recognize this is a pretty high risk situation. If I'd keep a very close eye on this, because that is a pretty high risk situation. So getting immediate support for the caregiver, I would put that as top of my problem list.
And talking it through with them, right? And so if you
absolutely,
yeah. So if they say this is a trigger, they shared their own history with you, and then you talk through, that could just be supportive in and of itself, right?
Yep.
Yeah, I agree. Getting support for the caregiver would be really paramount here, because they're not going to be able to be available emotionally to the young person if they are in their own trigger, their own trauma. And so giving them the support to be able to manage that, both in the moment, but also as throughout the course of the relationship, because it's not going to be just during these conversations that the parent, that the caregiver is going to be finding themselves triggered. And we keep going back to building that relationship. And if there's going to be able to support the young person in their life, it's going to be about helping also to manage it so that they're not unintentionally pushing that off onto the young person who also is going through it.
Yeah. There's a question here. Any other thoughts there, Tony?
No.
Yeah. So somebody asked, what can family expect during assessment for suicidality or hospitalization? I have referred clients and they seem to have such a terrible experience that the child will no longer disclose if they still feel suicidal. And it's worrisome. Most clients are not hospitalized in my experience. And I think that's the goal of our brochure. That's the goal of our brochure, and the goal of this webinar is to, how do you prevent hospitalization? How do you intervene in a way that it doesn't go there, that we can really have caregivers play this important role of supporting their young person? And sometimes it may require that. And you know what? You are absolutely correct. And it's so upsetting that we're in the middle of this crisis where our ERs are overwhelmed, where hospitals are overwhelmed. And I've known young people that had ideation and they were in waiting rooms for more than 24 hours, right? So it just is not okay right now. And it's just so sad to see and hear. And so our hope is, are there other ways to attend to this issue, right? Are there other ways to assess risk and intervene early and often? We do know that if we intervene early and often, that we will have better outcomes.
Yeah.
Any thoughts?
No, I just wanted to agree with you, Kara, that the attention of today's webinar is to prevent those situations from happening. Now, we know that they do come up, and we actually have linked some resources here that can help you all to deal with that. And it's potentially, it's something that we know is a need for potentially future offerings. And also there's a lot of great resources out there that you as a provider might utilize to help a caregiver consider whether hospitalization is the right option for the young person in their life, but also if they're deciding that the risk is acute enough that that's where the direction that they need to go, what do they need to know as the caregiver, as the child's advocate in terms of healthcare, as a child's support. So we've linked a guide here on psychiatric hospitalization for caregivers that we can be useful. You'll also see on here a link to a safety planning guide, which is, we had talked about safety planning earlier. There's also a link to here about what to do if a young person doesn't want help. And then as well as the link to our suicide prevention brochure.
And then I do want to say that, you are amazing. You chatted in some really amazing trainings, ASSIST, QPR training, the Columbia scale. So there are some resources that your colleagues also chatted in that I just want to point you to. Thank you so much, everyone, for being here. We do have a few upcoming events. Jackie, if you want to go to the next slide. As we say goodbye, we have Transition Age Youth Considerations for Increasing and Maintaining Engagement this Thursday, November 3rd. Burnout Prevention Through Compassion Training, Thursday, November 10th. That's going to be, both of those are going to be amazing events. So hope you can join us. Thank you again for being here. Tony, Jackie, any last thoughts?
No, just thank you for your very active participation. I can see people that this is a really serious issue. Folks have some experience with this and ideas. And it just reminds me that we just started this conversation today. But I think what the impression I get is we got to continue this conversation. So I think there'll be more to come to address this very important issue.
Absolutely. Have a good day, everyone.
Thank you all so much.
Take care, everybody. Best to all.
Bye.